Well, we're about 3 minutes after the hour. Why don't we get started? I'm David Haynes. I'm one of the co-leads, and I'm here with Governor Scott McCallum, our other co-lead, and Allison Keeley, our state coordinator. And we want to welcome special guests today to our monthly meeting of WisACT members. We're welcoming Charles Franklin. Charles is the director of the Marquette University Law School poll, and he has been since its inception in 2012. Charles became a full-time member of the law school faculty in 2013. The law school poll is one of the top polls in the country. It has accurately captured voter attitudes in the state of Wisconsin and beyond in every major election since 2012. Charles has used the poll to continue tracking political races of interest to voters and additional public policy issues over the years, including in recent years, polling on the U.S. Supreme Court, which has got a lot of national attention. Prior to joining the Marquette family, Charles was a professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And in addition to his work on polling, he's written extensively. His articles on partisanship, public opinion, and the U.S. Supreme Court, and on U.S. Senate elections have appeared in a number of major journals and book chapters. So with that, let me send it to Charles Franklin. Charles, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for excuse me. Thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here. I'm going to talk for 20 minutes or so and then open it up for Q&A. When a faculty member says he's going to talk for 20 minutes or so, you should expect 30, but we'll see if I can at least hold it down a little bit. And Dave has asked me to begin by talking a little bit about changes in the state over the last dozen years that we've been doing polling here, and a little longer from an elections point of view. So I'm going to start with that, and then we'll touch on the results of our latest Wisconsin poll, which was done beginning the week after the Republican convention. We're in the field today with a new poll following the DNC, so that'll be out on September 11th. But for now, we're going to talk about what we have data on. I'm going to try to share this screen, and you would think by now I would know how to do that, but hang on with me if anything goes wrong. Do not know why that screen is not sharing. Hang on a second. It's saying I have to grant Zoom access to my screen.
I think maybe someone needs to make you a co-host so that you can do it.
Maybe. I've never had this problem before, so it's a first for me. That's really annoying.
Otherwise, one of the co-hosts can grant you permission to share your screen. I think they can give you permission.
And I think that was done already.
Wait a second. I think maybe we've got it now.
Are
you seeing actually my Zoom screen, but I want you to see the slideshow. Okay, are you seeing a Marquette law poll banner?
Yes.
Great.
Yep.
Success. And it only took us, 2 minutes for me to manage that.
Pretty good.
All right.
Much faster than I could have done it.
So we want to start with talking about a little bit of change. One of the stunning things to me is that 4 of the last 6 presidential races have been decided by less than a percentage point. Actually, all 4 of those by less than 25,000 vote margins. So except for the 2 Obama elections, we've been a very close state for a long time. You might think that therefore nothing has changed, but what I'm going to partly talk to you about is under the hood, we've actually seen quite a bit of change, but it's been bizarrely offsetting, so that despite the change in the individual parts, we're nevertheless seeing a continuation of a very closely divided state. So this is the map of the 2004 election on the left, George W. Bush versus John Kerry, and on the right, 2020, Joe Biden and Donald Trump. This is county level vote with blue for Democratic majorities, red for Republican majorities. I think you're familiar with this. But I want to remind you that 2004 was decided by 13,000 votes, 2020 by 21,000 votes. So we have a split in the state that's not quite identical, but it's under 0.7 of a percentage point in both cases. But on the left in 2004, you see the Republican eastern half of the state pretty clearly, and the WOW counties stand out quite distinctly. But then in the West and the Northwest, you see an awful lot of very light colors. Democrats winning counties by a small margin, light red or pink. Republicans winning by a slight margin. Notice that those very close races go all the way up to the north until you get to the Lake Superior counties, which are blue in both cases, though a little less blue now. And when you look at how that pattern appeared in 2004, not only was the state very competitive, but a lot of individual counties were quite competitive, tipping a little red or a little blue, but with real regional diversity as well. When you jump over to 2020, you see this much redder overall map because more counties have become moderately to solidly Republican. You see those light blues in the Southwest mostly disappearing except for Iowa and La Crosse counties. And further north, only Eau Claire remaining a little blue. But you'd also notice if you looked hard that the WOW counties don't look as red as they were. You might discern that there's been a little bit of drift in the Fox Valley counties, but they're still tilting a little bit Republican. And so what we've seen is actually a lot of geographic realignment in the state over this time, with the suburbs becoming, especially around Milwaukee, becoming a bit less Republican, but the North and West becoming much more Republican. Just mentally impose on that 2004 map Dave Obey's old 7th Congressional District and see how competitive that area was, and reelecting Obey, of course. But then in 2020, the 7th District is quite a red district, quite solidly Republican. That urban-rural split is something that's been part of Wisconsin politics, as far as I can tell, back to at least the 1950s, if not before. But in the last 20 years, that divide has grown more and more substantial, meaning that the north and west of the state, which is about 26% of registered voters in the state, is now a much more Republican area, certainly in geographic area terms. What you don't see here is the cities and large villages throughout the state, which have generally been trending more and more Democratic. And that is part of the balancing act here, is that while at the county level, you see a lot more Republican areas, within those counties, there are significant Democratic bastions in the larger places and very strong Republican places in the towns and smaller villages in those areas. I guess the last thing I didn't mention is to notice how much bluer Dane County has gotten. Dane County was a Democratic place in 2004, but now it is an unbelievably Democratic place, with margins pushing 60% more Democratic than Republican, and turnout as a percentage of registered voters continuing to rise. And Dane has been the fastest growing county in the state for 20 years, so that the size of the vote in Dane keeps going up, turnout keeps going up, and Democratic margins keep going up. So that in the primary last month, I guess it was actually this month, wasn't it? Dane County had more total votes than Milwaukee County did, despite the difference in population size. Now, that almost surely won't happen in November when we have a higher turnout election generally, but it just speaks to how important Dane has become to to Democratic support. The WOW counties have moved in the other direction. In 2020, the WOW counties cast 40,000 fewer net Republican votes than they did in 2012. Statewide, the race was decided by under 21,000 votes. So 40,000 votes lost in the WOW counties is a substantial loss looking to statewide races. So why hadn't that really tipped the races more dramatically? It's because that north and west part of the state has gained almost exactly as many Republican votes as have been lost in the WOW counties. And so we come back to this relatively even balance in the state, despite quite a lot of regional change. So that's the first thing I want to say. We could speak a little bit about polarization. You certainly see in the 2020 votes that there's a lot more darker red or a little bit of darker blue than there was in 2004. Certainly the redder areas have gotten redder, and some of the light blue areas have become light red. But you look at the way elections are decided here, and it's pretty hard to ignore Milwaukee and Dane County, Rock County, Iowa County, La Crosse, Eau Claire, and then Brown, Ashland, and Douglas counties up north, and Menominee County, though that's a very small voting percentage, a small population, I mean. So there has been that kind of polarization growth. And we tend to think of it that way, the urban part of the state versus the rural part of the state and so on. But I want to show you what polarization looks like, not at the state level, but at the county level. So here's Brown County.
Yeah, there's some at my feet.
Somebody should mute a mic. The city of Green Bay is very blue. Some of the suburbs are blue as well. But then you very rapidly move out into quite Republican and extremely Republican rural areas in the towns outside of that urban core. So this is polarization at the county level, not just polarization at the state level. And it's quite dramatic. Let's look at not an urban area, because you could argue this is urban versus rural. Let's look at Vernon County. I think this is stunning. It takes away my breath every time I look at it. You can see Viroqua is deep blue, but there are other villages in the area that are red. And indeed, some of those red villages are surrounded by blue towns. It's quite a mix. Granted, low population, relatively speaking. But here's an example within one of our more rural, quite rural, Western communities that just, I think, illustrates profoundly what I'm talking about, that we're divided at this county level at least as much, if not more, as we're divided at the state level. I don't have any answers to this in the sense of what's that doing, but it sure makes me wonder how county boards and county governments are handling this kind of a division within their counties over things that, you know, like road maintenance, which you might not think would be deeply partisan. But I do think we see this in many, many counties. I've made these maps for all 72 counties, and while I'm tempted to take you through all of them, I'll tell you what we mostly see. Most counties have something that looks a little bit like Vernon or a little like Brown County, where the towns are mostly red, the villages and the cities are mostly blue to different degrees of intensity. Vernon is a little unusual because of the mix of villages going Republican, towns going Democratic, and then the reverse, which is more common, blue villages and surrounding red towns. But even if you go up into the northern and more rural parts of the state, go to Dunn County, for example, and you see that the villages there are either light blue or at the very least noticeably less red than the surrounding counties. So this urban-rural split happens at every level of geography in the state, and it speaks to some levels of division that don't have anything to do about us versus Madison or us versus Milwaukee. They have real divisions within the counties themselves. So I'm going to stop there on the county side, but I'd be happy to show you the other 70 maps. I wanted to talk a little bit about change in our polling over time. And sorry, these are in table form. You do not have to read every number. I'm going to tell you what you're supposed to see out of these. In 2012 to 2014, we had about a 4-point Democratic majority in the state, 31 Democrat to 27 Republican, about 40% independent. I'll tell you, if you ask those independents if they lean or feel closer to one party or another, it splits almost evenly, 16% lean Republican, 16% lean Democratic, and that's hardly changed over time. And that leaves us with between 8 and 10 or so percent that think of themselves as purely independent. But because the leaners break evenly, if there's a 2-point or here a 4-point margin for Democrats, it's still about a 4-point margin when you include the leaners. Then look at the last row, which is since 2020, and it's now a 30% Republican plurality, 29% Democrat, still 40% independent, still about 16 leaning towards each party. So the state has evolved over this time from a small 4-point majority or plurality, Democrat, to now a near tie, but a 1-point Republican plurality. And as I say, the independents split about evenly between the parties in leans. By far, the biggest element of this change is white men without a college degree, which is a big chunk of the electorate here. And it's a group that has moved from around 4 points more Republican than Democrat in 2012 to around 25% more Republican than Democrat now. No other demographic group in the state has changed by nearly that amount. Also, that change comes in the Walker years. It predates the changes that follow in Trump's years. So this change, which is not really apparent in this table, but it is if you look at it in finer detail, shows this growth, especially among non-college white men, occurring throughout the 2012 to 2017 period, has largely leveled off in recent years, but the cumulative effect of that and some smaller movements in other groups brings us to this slight Republican majority among registered voters. If we look at the makeup of the parties, so let me walk through this slowly, again, not expecting you to read all these numbers. But in 2012 to 14, of Republican identifiers in the state, 65% of those Republicans were non-college graduates, 34% were college graduates. Now, in this post-2020 period, it's 67% non-college, 33% college. You might think with the reputation of the shift of blue-collar voters to the Republican Party that would shift more. But you should remember that the state is about 65 or 66% non-college. And so in that sense, the Republicans are pretty much or close to a mirror of the state in terms of college or non-college education. It's moved by 2 points in a Republican direction. Yeah, let's not make too much of a 2-point move, but that's just a slight movement there. dropped down to the Democrats. And in 2012 to 14, Democrats were nearly the exact match for Republicans, 67 non-college, 33 college. Sorry, 64 non-college, 36 college, virtually the same. But that's shifted more. Now Democrats are 57% non-college, but up to 42% college graduates. This is where the education divide in the state has grown substantially over these last 12 years. But it's not so much the Republicans becoming more non-college as it is Democrats becoming noticeably less non-college and more college grads. That said, remember, it's a majority of both parties that are still non-college graduates. So both parties have lots of non-college people in them, but there has been this marginal shift. I'm going to give short shrift to independents. There's been a little bit of a shift among independents to being slightly more college grads, but I'm really focusing on the parties here. So there is this shift in educational and partisanship, but it's one that's more a shift among Democrats than it is among Republicans. What about gender? If we look at the Republicans at the top, they were dead on 50-50 in 2012 and 14. Now they're about 53 male, 47 female, a little bit of movement to a more male party. But what's happening on the Democratic side shows the other effect. In 2012 to 14, Democrats were already a substantial majority women, 62% women to 32% male. Now it's 65 female to 34 male. So a real gender gap in party identification, not just in vote, not just in feelings about the candidates, but in the underlying partisanship. And this is the foundation for why we see substantial gender gaps in almost every election. It's because women are much more part of the Democratic Party rather than men. And the Republican Party is leaning a bit male, but still much more evenly balanced than Democrats are. Independents a little bit more male than female. We've talked a lot in the last few years about race and education and gender as three things that together pack a considerable political wallop. And you see a little bit of movement here. The Republicans at the beginning of this were 29% white non-college men. And today that group makes up 32% of the Republican Party. White non-college women have barely changed from 31 to 30. White college men have barely changed 1 point from 16 to 17. White college women down a point from 15 to 14. So not much movement there, except a little bit more with the non-college white men. And I told you about how they've shifted in their partisanship. And you see very few Republicans who fall into any of the non-white categories in the state. Of course, we're a uniquely highly white population with only modest numbers of people of color in the state. So these small percentages largely reflect just how small a share of the state's population people of color are. But if you look at the Democratic side, those white non-college men have dropped from 19 to 16%. White non-college women have actually bumped up by a single point. White college males up 2 points from 11 to 13, and white college females up 4% from 21 to 25%. And here you see a bit more of the Democratic coalition made up of non-whites. We have about 16% of Democrats who were non-white in the beginning of this period. Today, that's about 12%. So not a whole lot of movement in that. More so than in the Republican Party, of course, but still, because of the small population, a small amount. But here again, you see the gender and especially the education among whites as being the one element that's moving a bit in the parties. Religion has shifted a bit in some ways, a little surprisingly, in others not. If you look at born again Protestants, that's actually gone down among Republicans from 31% to 26%. Mainline Protestants about the same, 25 to 26. Roman Catholics have grown by 3% from 29 to 32. And people without a religion or no religious affiliation, 7 and 8, hardly any change. But Democrats have dropped a lot in some of these categories of born again Protestants, dropping from 15% of the Democratic Party in 2012 to only 9% now. Mainline Protestants, 1 point up. Roman Catholics down 4 points. And no religion going up dramatically from 17% to 33%. Now, those, the so-called tongue-in-cheek religious nuns, those with no religion, have been growing fast throughout the country and fast here in Wisconsin. But you can see they make up a disproportionate amount of growth in the Democratic Party while having almost no effect, no change among Republicans. And then there is the other religion category, which is very heterogeneous because it's everything that doesn't fit into the categories you see here. Not a whole lot of change in those groups, even though they're a very mixed group. Religious affiliation has become more closely associated with partisanship in the last dozen or so years, and it's quite substantial shifts in the Democratic coalition. Finally, ideological change has happened, but again, more for Democrats than for Republicans. In 2012, 77% of Republicans said they were conservatives. Now it's 80%, a 2-point bump. Moderates have dropped by 2 points, and liberals, which were not big to begin with, have voted to drop to near extinction level from 3% to 1% of Republicans. But on the Democratic side, we've seen a 10 percentage point drop in conservatives. That was not an insignificant 17% of the Democratic Party in 2012. It's now down to 7%. And moderates have also dropped from 33 down 4 points to 29. And liberals have grown substantially from 46 up to 62. So that's a really quite substantial 16-point increase in the share of Democrats that think of themselves as liberals. So if we kind of summarize all of this about what's been changing in the last 12 years here, the party balance has shifted very slightly to the Republican advantage. The educational and class makeup of the parties has shifted a bit, with Democrats becoming more highly educated, Republicans not changing much, but a smidgen more non-college grads. But the role that education plays in voting decisions has also increased independent of being in which party. And so that's a contributor. Then if we move out into the broader social sphere with religion, you can see the Democratic Party is now a much more secular party than it was. The growth
Excuse
of
me,
the
Charles, we're still
Yeah.
on table 27. Is that what we should be looking at?
Yeah, I'm talking now
No,
verbally
you're just in general. Okay,
reviewing,
thank you.
not jumping through the tables. Thanks though, because don't assume that I didn't make a mistake. But I'm just trying to review what we saw.
Okay,
I want to say recapitulate a good elections term. In any case, so religiously, we're seeing more of a divide now than we used to. This growing secular trend in society has been there for a while, but as I showed you, it's leaning more of a secular trend in the Democratic Party than in the Republican Party, and a little shift in terms of what faith tradition people come from. Oh, I didn't get to this one, so let's do abortion. Certainly currently an issue. Overall, the makeup of the Republican Party's views on abortion haven't changed very much. Back in 2012 to 14, it was 34% of Republicans who thought abortion should be legal in all or most cases. That's 33% now. Most of these surveys are post-Dobbs, though there's a couple from 21 and 22 that are pre-Dobbs. What did change a bit is the illegal in all cases has fallen from 24 to 15%. So about a 9-point decline in that hardest of anti-abortion, pro-life position. But the movement didn't flip to the other side. It simply moved to illegal in most cases. And of course, there's tremendous debate about what we mean by illegal in most cases or legal in most cases. It's ambiguous exactly what that line is. But as a result, the basic balance in the GOP hasn't shifted, though the illegal in all has gone down a little bit. But if you go to the Democrats, you go from what was already a sizable majority favoring abortion rights, legal in all or most. That was 67% back in 2012-14. But now it's over 90%, 56 and 37 in those two categories. 93% of Democrats saying abortion should be legal in all or most. And on the part of the party that was willing to accept at least some restrictions, 18% back in 2012, that's dropped to just 6% now. Also, let's look at independents in this case, where a majority have favored abortion rights throughout this period. There's been a slight uptick in independents favoring, but they've been running in the mid 60% range for a while. A little bit like Republicans, those most opposed to abortion has dropped a little bit, but by only about 4% for independents. So that bigger change is on the Democratic side, and it does produce a much more unified party, even though it was pretty unified even back in 2012. So since abortion politics doesn't seem likely to vanish from our various policy debates, I think it's worth noting that. Okay, I'm going to stop on that part, and let me just really quickly hit where the race is right now, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Here you see the dividing line, that vertical bar for when Biden withdraws. Biden had fallen off after the debate, but he had been trailing in all of the polling averages going back through this year and actually back to last October. Harris got an immediate bump up, but then you see that her share of the vote has been rising steadily ever since. Trump initially held stable, then dipped to about a point, and has held close to that 1-point dip, maybe a slight decline. But Harris has clearly been rising faster than Trump has been declining. As a result, the average as of last night, when I caught this image off the website, is Harris ahead by 1.5 points nationally. National races, national vote don't win the Electoral College, right? These 7 sort of yellowish or gold colored states are the 7 that everybody agrees are the toss-up states. But if you look at how they've been polling, you see the columns for RCP, Real Clear Politics average. 5:30 was the day Trump was convicted in New York. 6:27 was the day of the presidential debate. 7:21 was the day Biden dropped out. And then 8:18 was the last reading before the Democratic convention began. What you can see, first of all, is just that Trump has been leading or tied in the swing states throughout this period until this most recent reading. And so while the national vote has remained close, the Electoral College looked pretty good for Donald Trump throughout the spring and first part of the summer. Trump gained in all of those states after the debate, but he has now lost some in all of those states between the day that Biden dropped out and the 18th. That still doesn't give Harris any sizable lead anywhere. 1 point on average here in Wisconsin, 2 points in Michigan, 0.2 of a point in Arizona, which basically says toss up, 1/10 of a point for Trump in Pennsylvania, and then about a 1 point or a little more lead for Trump in Georgia, North Carolina, and Nevada. So this means that the Electoral College remains very much a toss up at this point, but it is an improvement for Harris over where it was for Biden on the day he dropped out. If you put those states in play and you give Trump the Sun Belt, North Carolina that he won last time, Georgia and Arizona and Nevada, that puts him at 268 electoral votes. You need 270 to win. So where do the next 2.2 electoral votes come from? Well, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Any one of those would put him over. The only scenario if the Sun Belt stays for Trump is that Harris sweeps the Great Lakes states. If you did that, we would be at 270 to 268, as close as you can possibly be in the Electoral College. And if you notice out there in the middle, Nebraska, of all places, has a blue square in it. And that's because Nebraska casts electoral votes by congressional district, and the Omaha district leans Democratic. Harris is leading by about 5 in that district in a poll from this week. Take away that Omaha seat vote, and it's a 269 tie, goes to the House of Representatives. But you can also see the pathways to victory that can open here. For Trump, it's holding those currently red states that I have in red and picking up Pennsylvania or Michigan or Wisconsin. For Harris, who's doing a bus tour in Georgia this week, it's to try to open up one of those southern tier states, maybe Georgia, maybe Arizona. I've not thought North Carolina was going to be very competitive, but right now the polling looks sort of competitive there. Nevada's kind of the surprise state, the one that should be more Democratic, but has been leaning towards Trump all year. I'm going to stop there and open it up for questions.
Thank you, Charles. So I'd ask.
And I'm going to unshare this screen.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. I'd ask everyone we've got a couple questions in the chat. We'll get to those, but if you'd like to ask a question, if you could raise your hand, and you can do that by clicking the React button down there. It looks like a heart, and there'll be a raise hand. And then we'll get to everyone who's got a question. So let's start with Brian.
Maybe we could start with the union question that's been coming in from several people. Charles, this is on the trend of union membership and how the membership is trending partisan-wise.
Yeah, I probably should have included that in the trend pictures the tables that I was telling you about. The bottom line is the number of union members has fallen off dramatically in the last 12 years, but it's been falling nationally as well. We were up to the point of the high teens, low 20s in either union members or members of union households. That's down to about 6 or 7% now. So it's well down. Many of those union members still consider themselves Democrats, so that percentage would be lower among Democrats, but still union members seeing themselves that way. But there has been some erosion, and you think about what I told you has changed among non-college white men, who are a significant fraction of at least the non-public sector unions. There has been slippage in their votes for Democrats over that time. But overall, the group is just substantially smaller than it was a dozen or 20 years ago.
All right, thank you. Brian Coker, why don't you go next?
Very much. I'm curious, there's been a lot of talk in just polling about whether or not it's reflective of the vote of the votes that we see. Like in 2020, it seemed to overestimate Republicans in 2020 and 2022. Are you still seeing that? Has there been corrections to how polling is happening? And I guess what are your thoughts?
Yeah, there've certainly been efforts at correction. We'll know in middle of November whether those were successful or not. And I mean that sort of seriously. There is no way to know for sure if we fixed the problem until we have a vote. We're looking at all kinds of things and they seem to make sense. But that underestimate of Trump's vote in 2016 and a somewhat smaller but still underestimate of him in 2020 still haunts pollsters. And it certainly is a good reason, as you're looking at all polling results, mine is included, is to mentally say, okay, this is where the pollster thinks it is. What if we did see an error of 2 or 3 percentage points that would be an error in Trump's favor, that he would do better than what the polls show? So I do think that's an important thing to pay attention to. Unless you want, I'm not going to go into the details of the polling changes, but just generally, our changes now make a much bigger effort to make sure that, for example, in, say, the Green Bay media market, in the past, we would have sampled that Green Bay market, the multiple counties in the market. And while we'd make sure that we had the right 21 or 22% of all our respondents came from the Green Bay market, we didn't control to make sure that we were getting the right percentages from the rural parts of that area rather than the more urban parts of Green Bay, the Green Bay market. Now we divide the entire state into 90 different regions, and we sort those from the most Republican to the most Democratic. And we now make sure we're getting the right percentage of respondents from the most Republican parts of the Green Bay market and the most Democratic parts and the most competitive parts. That means we're more sure that we're representing the types of areas around the state and their past voting behavior. But what we can't do is force anybody to answer our damn poll. And so we still run the risk that if Republicans as a group are more skeptical about pollsters and about the media, and may also therefore be less willing to participate in polls, we can't make them do it. We can be sure that we got about the right number of people from that most Republican area of the media market, but there's no absolute guarantee that those folks are accurately representing even Republicans within those areas. So that's the challenge. We're doing the best we can. There are things that we've always done, like weighting by education to make sure that we're not getting too many highly educated and Democratic-leaning people. But we've done that all along. So that's the main point. The second point would be our overall error in the Marquette poll over all of the general elections we've done is to be off by an average of 2.2 percentage points on the margin between the two candidates. But in 2016, we were off by over 6. And in 2020, we were off by about 4. At least in 2020, we got the winner right, but we got the winner wrong in 2016 as well. So those are the two that haunt you. But 2018, we had the governor's race within 1 point and the Senate race within 1/10 of a point. So that's important because it says polling wasn't broken because we were basically doing the same methodology. It does seem like Trump has a disproportionate effect on people not responding who are favorable to Trump, supporting Trump. I don't think it's shy Trump voters. I think it's anti-media, anti-pollster, anti-establishment politics. But I've told you what we've done to try to mitigate that. But we'll see when the time comes in November whether we got a better result or not. And that's true of the whole polling industry, I should say. The whole industry has moved in these kinds of ways to try to mitigate the errors of the past.
John Franke.
Charles, my question starts with polling, but maybe it goes beyond what polling can tell us. It seems like the charts you had up at the outset confirmed that Wisconsin, like the rest of the country, maybe for many decades, we increasingly reside with neighbors who are not politically diverse.
Yes.
And is there any polling that I assume that's a pretty established fact, but is there any polling that goes beyond that to explore the extent to which the groups we belong to, the schools we go to, the churches, the community groups, the workplaces are also, logic
Right.
tells me that they would also be less politically diverse. And anything polling can tell us about the implications for political dialogue.
Right. That's largely correct. My colleague at the law school, John Johnson, has done a tremendous amount of work on this using ward level vote returns. And what he shows is that the homogeneity of wards that people live in and therefore vote in has grown substantially over the last 25 years since 2000. So that now a huge percentage of the population lives in a ward that voted over 65% for the majority party, either Democrat or Republican. And of course, some of those wards are even more lopsided than that. So there's a small range of competitive wards and as a fraction of the population, a small percentage of the population that lives in them. So I think that's the better than polling. That's the really good indication of just how we are living in more homogeneous places. Now, maybe we drive to a place of worship that's more heterogeneous. Maybe we engage in civic affairs in ways that are more heterogeneous. But I think the polling evidence is that people remain pretty isolated, report having fewer friends of the opposite party than they used to. We're going to have a question related to this on the poll that's coming up in a couple of weeks about whether people think that political division is more because of the elected officials, or is it more because people are more divided? We asked that question back in 2012, so I'm really interested to see how that's changed in this upcoming poll. We talk a lot about media silos and people only paying attention to their favorite cable news outlet, and there's certainly some truth to that. But a fair bit of research shows people actually expose themselves to a variety of outlets. It's just that they do it to vehemently disagree with one of those outlets. So that even being exposed to another point of view tends to lead people to more solid opposition to that viewpoint rather than being convinced of anything.
We're going to go to a question in our chat in just a second, but before we do that, while we still have everyone here, a quick commercial for WisACT. We're going to be doing 3 in-person events this fall in October. The first on October 1st in Appleton with Common Ground Fox Cities. That will be a facilitated table discussion. The stars of that show are Reed Rebel, former Republican congressman from that region, and former Democratic Lieutenant Governor Barbara Lawton. Then on October 8th and October 15th, we will be at UWM in Milwaukee and UW Green Bay, respectively, for workshops on de-escalation training. Basically, how to have better conversations with people you disagree with, whether that's at a polling place or over the Thanksgiving dinner table. So more details to come on that. And let's go back to the question. Michael Moran, if you're still on, can you hop off mute? You had a question about the difference in sort of language between conservative, moderate, and liberal.
Yeah. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yep.
You can.
Oh, there it goes. There it goes. Sorry, everything went black for a second. Yeah. So I was wondering if part of the change is because those terms have somewhat been redefined over the last couple of years. You know, an example would be like if you look at like a lot of positions, it seems like there's been a shift in terms of what was, you know, liberal versus moderate. So for instance, you know, several people who that I know in my life, right, that would have considered themselves conservatives, you know, 20 years ago, now clearly are moderates. In the same way, a lot of folks that would consider themselves moderates have probably drifted now more, I would say, liberal, if that makes sense. I mean, you know, like obviously people change their views, but I mean, in terms of like what their views actually were versus, you know, how they define themselves within the population now. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And there are two sort of quick answers to it, but then it's an unsatisfactory detailed answer. On all along, we have asked people to place themselves on a 5-point scale from very conservative, conservative, moderate, liberal, very liberal. The distribution along that for the whole state hasn't changed much over that time. There's a plurality that's conservative or very conservative, usually in the mid 30% range to the upper 30s. For liberals, it's between 21 and 26 or 7, maybe a little bit of gain in that category recently. And then the moderates are the bigger group in the middle, running in the 30s most of the time. But then what policies are we talking about when we see those things? And which candidates embody those things? So here, there is good evidence in our data that Trump has come to be seen as more conservative over his time in public office. Most people now put him in the very conservative category. A fair chunk put him in the conservative category, but only 10% call him moderate, and obviously less on the liberal side. So there does seem to be a general perception that at least Donald Trump and the Republican Party, if we ask about Republican Party, have moved further to the right over this last 12 years. Democrats also seem to have moved to the left, though here we don't have an equivalent of Donald Trump to measure over all that time. People see Harris as pretty liberal, though 20% say she's moderate versus 10% who say Trump's moderate. The other thing is sort of the definition, and especially whether the term liberal is a poison pill. We did a randomized experiment where we asked half of the people using the liberal term to place themselves and half to ask using the progressive term. And at least in 2014, I think when we did that, we saw no difference in the percentages choosing that. People just took liberal and progressive as essentially equal and opposite. We haven't repeated that lately. Maybe it's worthwhile to do it again. But then finally, there is this question about what do we mean by these terms? I mean, right now, if you think about deporting immigrants who are here illegally, that's getting nearly 65% approval. It's quite a strong support for one of Trump's more surprising, extreme policy proposals. And, you know, you kind of would have thought that would have been on the outer limits of a policy proposal a few years ago. But it does show that big chunks of independents, again, big majorities of independents, and even sizable percentages of Democrats favor deportation. So that's a different kind of way of thinking about the issue. If we talked about these specific areas, how much has changed? Abortion's the one thing that hadn't changed very much. Throughout this period overall, it's in the low to mid 60s favoring abortion rights, mid 30s opposed. That's changed by no more than a couple of 4 points in the post-Dobbs period.
Let's go to Ellen Gilligan next.
Myself off mute, always the big challenge. Thank you very much, Charles, and thank you for WisACT. This has been a great and very enlightening conversation. My question goes beyond polling a bit as well, and I don't know whether this is appropriate for this conversation, but I think it is appropriate for WisACT in the terms of free and fair elections and the closeness that Wisconsin is going to experience in this election, and what impact state laws, the culling of registered voters, all the things that may impact both turnout and elections will have on this election. And I hope that WisACT is going to take an active role in ensuring that people understand what free and fair elections actually are.
Right. Yeah, this has been an ongoing concern, obviously, since 2020 for us. On the attitudinal side, we haven't seen very much shift, and we've repeated the question many times. about 65% say that the 2020 elections were accurately cast and counted, but about 35% say they were not. But if you look at Republicans, it's about 65 saying they were not accurate, 35% were accurate. And those numbers have hardly changed in the last 4 years. So this is something that I almost want to say has become an identity. If you're a Republican, you question the 2020 election. If you're a Democrat, not surprisingly, 90% plus think it was free and fair, and 65% of independents think it was accurate. But we've just not seen movement on that, any kind of calming of the differences or anything like that. I think right now, what I'm watching that's not polling is what are the court cases that are going to bubble up between now and election day, challenges to whatever, whether it's drop boxes or early voting or curing mail-in ballots, all of those kinds of problems that are kind of routine technical problems, but they've become so sharply political now that they're hard to deal with. We just yesterday saw the Elections Commission rule to keep Jill Stein and Cornel West on the ballot and to also keep Robert Kennedy on the ballot. And there was some partisan division over that, though it was ultimately resolved 5-1. But just this morning, I was talking to another group, and I felt like I had to remind them that exactly the same thing on the ballot occurred in 2022 when an independent candidate for governor suspended her campaign and endorsed Tim Michels, but also was past the deadline for getting her name off the ballot. And so she stayed on the ballot. So this case for Kennedy follows exactly that decision 2 years ago and clearly seems to follow the clear language of the law. But that's a good example of a case where conspiracy can kind of pop up because Democrats wanted Kennedy to stay on and Republicans wanted him off. And in the end, he's still on, but that was just following routine. So trying to convince people that decisions that follow precedent and follow routine are still legitimate, I think is a huge challenge. And, you mentioned purging voter rolls. Voter rolls do need to be purged because people do move, they do change their registration status and so on. Now, those things are routinely done, and a lot of people may not realize that. But that's another area where we've certainly had suspicions raised that people were being purged to prevent them from voting. So that's another legitimate concern, but it's also part of the routine process. So I'll leave it to y'all to soothe the waters on this and bring wisdom to the state.
Well, and to answer the question directly on WisACT and what WisACT is doing, one step, as many of you know, is to educate voters, educate the public in the process itself. Understanding the process gives you more confidence in that it's working. The other is, and we'll refer you to our website with petitions. People, and we found in the focus groups we've done, people tend to trust what's happening locally, but don't trust as much what is happening elsewhere. So the problem may be in North Carolina or in Wisconsin. We say, well, it's Green Bay or it's Milwaukee. Unless you're Green Bay, you think it's Milwaukee. So people think it's taking place elsewhere, which is why we are now creating regional directors and why petitions that we have. And I encourage you to just circulate a petition, because the more people we have in each community, the greater strength there is in that community to encourage people to follow a process. And the process is nonviolence. It's not conspiracy theory. Let the process work. If it needs to go to court, it will. If it's just, most mistakes that occur are typical small human error mistakes. So let us resolve those through the process. So again, that's what WisACT is doing, but that's why everybody on this is so important. If you can sign petitions and bring more members on, it gives great strength to being able to believe in democracy and follow the process.
Yeah, and I would add too that on occasion where we feel it's necessary, we are correcting the record. There was a claim in the last couple of weeks that inactive voters somehow were being used in the state in a fraudulent way. In fact, there's a large list of inactive voters that are maintained under state law, but they can't get a ballot. They can't get a ballot, even an absentee ballot. It just can't happen. And so we wrote an op-ed that was published by the Cap Times last week that sort of corrected that record. So that's another piece of what WisACT is doing along the lines of what Governor McCallum is saying in terms of education. Let's go to, we have, Charles, we're past the top of the hour. Can you go a couple more questions? I think we
Sure.
have a few more. All right, cool. Let's go to Dave Hoover next. Dave?
Sure. My question is, how do you know if a poll is legit? You know, I get various things that come in the inbox. Most of them end up with a donate button. But how do I know, you know, how do I participate in a Marquette poll? How do I know which ones are the ones that count?
Yeah, it's awfully hard to know, certainly for somebody not in the industry. The short answer is if it comes with a donate button, no. But I think you already knew that. What we do is we sample randomly from the registered voter list in the state. So you can't volunteer to be in the Marquette poll. I occasionally get emails saying, "Oh, I'd love to do it. Let's sign me up." And nope, sorry, it doesn't operate that way. What we do now, which is different from the older days, is you sample from that registered voter list, and we send you an email that says, "This is the Marquette poll. We'd like to interview you. Here's a link to click on." We also send a text message with the same information on it. People are, of course, trained to be suspicious of links in unsolicited emails and text messages. So aside from identifying who we are and providing an email link to write with questions if you have doubts, that's the information people see, and then they choose to do it or not do it. I usually get between 1 and 3 questions, email or phone call during a polling period saying, "I got this thing claiming to be the Marquette poll. Is it really you?" That's a small percentage of people that do that, but it does happen. I guess the biggest issue that I think is so hard to answer is polling that is still based on random selection of respondents. That's what we're doing, randomly selecting from the voter list. Or some pollsters still randomly sample from phone numbers, though that number's going down. Those methods that have a probability basis to the sampling have been shown to be more accurate than the polls that invite people to volunteer and sign up to do polls. Then they draw from that set of volunteers a demographically balanced sample. So the right percentage of white, black, Hispanic, right percentage of male and female in education. But they're still volunteers. They're still not a random sample of the country. And while some of those have done pretty well across 19 different polling organizations, those that used probability methods were shown to be better, more accurate across a number of measures of accuracy than those that used the volunteer method. The volunteer method is attractive for cost, and it's attractive for recruiting a big and diverse set of people willing to do them, but it's not so good for getting a really random representative sample of people. And so those are the ones that I would stay a little bit skeptical about. If you go to 538.com, they have a ranking of 500 and something pollsters. You can look at that. It tells you a little bit about their methodology, but more importantly, it shows how accurate those polls have been in recent years. And so that gives you a clue, but it's still only a clue about how well this one will do this time.
Got it. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. And let's go to Dan Conley and let's wrap it up with Dan. Thanks, Dan. Go ahead. I think you're on mute. You're muted, Dan.
Is that working?
Now we got you.
Sorry
Yep.
about that. Professor, briefly, a methodological question, and then I want to follow up on Ellen's question. As somebody who grew up north of Highway 8, how are you defining the 23% geographically from the north and the west?
Yeah, we do it by media markets. And so it's the La Crosse and Eau Claire media market, the Duluth Superior market, the Minneapolis St. Paul market, and the Wausau Rhinelander market. So that's it, but it's not much of a judgment call. It's by where the TV stations and the TV markets are.
And on Ellen's question, I remember giving you a hard time more than 10 years ago about why were you polling over voting fraud? Why don't you poll over Martians and similar things? And you made the good point, whether it exists or not, if people think it exists, it matters. You said that it has not really changed in the past 4 years, but going back over the past 10 years, how has that changed in locally or nationally?
Yeah, there's been a growth in the belief of illegal voting in various ways. If you go back to 2012, when we were first asking about whether to require a photo ID to vote in the state, a lot of the political rhetoric about that was raising the specter of people who shouldn't be allowed to legally vote, voting anyway. And so getting a photo ID was supposed to prevent that kind of election fraud. So that rhetoric, even though I don't believe there was much evidence for that really occurring in the time, but that rhetoric was very much driving the political policy debate about photo ID. And where we started out with an even division on photo ID, that grew by 2014, even 2015 for sure, into about a high 50% in favor of photo ID. The last time we asked it 3 or 4 years ago, it was up to over 60% favoring photo ID. So that's an example of a policy that was implemented largely on an argument about fraud, even though fraud didn't appear to be much of an issue, but where the public has now come to think of that as just ordinary and normal and with big approval of it. Whether the 2020 election was fraudulent, I told you, just over a third say that it was, at least to some degree. But that too is touchy or dependent on what you talk about. You know, if you think about fraud in terms of illegal votes being cast or returns being fraudulently counted, you know, there's no evidence that that happened. But if you think changing election rules in the midst of the pandemic was something that shouldn't have been done, then that's a more relevant case, I think. If you think about counting rules like whether or not you can count or start processing absentee ballots before election night, that has real consequences for how people see the legitimacy of elections. But we found ourselves in a 4-year stalemate about making any legislative changes to those rules. So I think, again, the most extreme form of fraud, the idea that illegal people are coming here and voting and damaging our elections, no, there's no evidence of that at all. But the idea that the rules have been fungible and maybe they've been manipulated in some cases to affect one party or another, I think those are things that in a better era, we could have a cogent conversation about and make some changes at the margins to improve the appearance of legitimacy. I think counting absentee ballots a little earlier would be an obvious example of that. But we've just been in this period for now a number of years, let's just say, of legislative and gubernatorial impasse, for a lot less willingness to negotiate on some of these issues. And therefore, it's been really hard to change them, especially when the parties are so divided over this issue and Republicans insisting on fraud as a driving element, most prevalently right now with the effort to pass a national bill banning non-citizens from voting, something that non-citizens already can't do. So that's letting the political agenda drive this issue in ways that are damaging, I think, to democratic legitimacy.
Well, Charles, I could talk to you all afternoon, but I know you must have better things to do. So we're going to let you go. And thank you to you, Charles Franklin of the Marquette University Law School, Paul, for being with us today. And thanks to all the members for taking the time out of your day to learn and to come here and chat with one another. We really appreciate it. Our next member meeting is September 25th. We'll be getting news out about that in our newsletter, which comes out every Wednesday. And don't forget our messaging campaign, which began last week. You'll get some more information about that from Allison coming up yet this week. And thanks a lot and enjoy your day.